So part one is kind of municipal elections, frequently asked questions. And then part two is kind of the basics of municipal government. So we'll start with frequently asked questions because that's probably the more pressing concern. So part one is really eligibility. So most people in this room probably have a sense of whether or not they're eligible already. But to remind you of what that entails, you need to be a Canadian citizen, at least 18 years of age, a resident of the municipality 6 months ahead of the nomination day or registration day. So March 13th, that's already passed. If you don't live where you're going to run by now, you're out. You have no debts owing to the municipality, or so no taxes owing that you're late for, or if you do, you've got an agreement with the municipality and you're paid up on whatever schedule that you've agreed to. And you're not a disqualified person, so if you're the returning officer, which I don't think anybody here is, or a prisoner, which I don't think anybody here is, there's a few other very obscure ones, people who can't be candidates. You can read the act to find them, but chances are if you held one of those positions, you'd know it. So you're eligible. If you're eligible, you can register. You need three things for being a candidate. You need an official agent, which you can be your own official agent. You need nominations papers with at least 5 signatures of people who live in the district you're going to run in. So that's the catcher. In the same way, you're not a candidate, you don't have access to the voters list until you register. But in order to register, you need 5 signatures of people who live there. So my recommendation would be get like 10 or 20 in case somebody either is lying to you or doesn't know whether or not they're in your district, because a lot of people don't give 2 hoots about what district they live in until the election time. So they may be overly excited that you're a candidate and want to nominate you, but you need 5 people who are actually registered, so be safe by getting more. And then we mentioned it before, a deposit that's required in some municipalities, usually around $200, maybe less, depending on the municipality. The third thing is just to have an awareness of the rules of municipal campaigns. Mainly, it's worth paying attention to them around money specifically. If you're running a campaign, you need to set up an independent bank account for the campaign that is not your personal bank account or an organization's bank account that you're a part of. Makes it easier for keeping track of things, but is also required by law to manage your money. I mentioned it in the earlier presentation. There's no real restrictions on who or what entities, including companies and nonprofits, can give to a political campaign, or how much you can spend. So that's unlimited at this point, and I'll just reiterate it again in case you're watching a separate video on our YouTube channel, that this is April 2nd, and there's rumors that that may change in the upcoming spring sitting in the legislature. So if you're watching this after that's happened, take a look. We'll have a post on the Local Decisions website about this if it changes. But make sure to not trust this. But yeah, there's no limits at this point in time on how much money you can take in or how much you can spend on elections campaigns. All that is required is that you disclose the names and amounts that donors give for anything over $50. I'll also say that a kind of good practice that a lot of candidates are doing now for transparency's sake is disclosing those names in advance and even setting their own restrictions. So there's a number of candidates in Halifax in particular where developer money plays a big role in financing councillors' campaigns. So some candidates, and I know Way is one of them who's coming later, have just said, I'm not taking more than $1,000 from any individual, and I won't take any money from a company or a union. That's not required, but it is something, I guess, getting back to kind of strategy that some voters do find appealing. So it may be something on principle that you want to do, but it's not required. And then, so that's money, and you have to file that list of donors within 60 days of the election. And again, if you disclose it in advance, that's up to you. You can put it on your website. You eventually have to publish it anyways, so it may be advantageous politically or just because it's reflective of principles you might hold to do so in advance. Timelines. So really, actually there is a, there is a slide coming up with some timelines. Can you switch it, Delane? So these are some key timelines to keep in mind. Already mentioned March 13th. If you're not a resident yet, you're out of the race. September 13th is when nominations are due, deposit, and your official agent has to be appointed. And it appears that there is a window of time where you can register. So you may want to check into that with your local elections office to figure out how early in advance you can register. And some places, I believe it's only 1 or 2 days. So make sure you're around or somebody is to do it for you. September 14th, deadline for candidates to withdraw candidacy is right after the deadline for nominations. I think the reasoning there is so that if Wei and I and Delane all enter the race at the same time and don't know that some of our favorite people are running, that one of us or two of us can pull out to support the other. But after that point, you're on the ballot, even if the person next to you is your best friend. October 6th and 8th, optional advance poll days. This is kind of technical because there's a lot of optional things. And some municipalities will also introduce e-voting. That's different by municipality. It's not regulated. So look into it. More for strategy than for requirements. October 15th, or October 11th is the advance poll days, which happens to fall on Thanksgiving weekend, I believe, or right after. And then October 15th, Election Day. October 22nd is the date by which you have to have your signs down, return the voters list, or you lose your money. And that is all that I was going to cover on kind of like the technical stuff around running for election. The other half of the presentation is more around kind of like the basics of municipal government and the councillor's role there. But I'll pause here if there are any questions or comments about kind of the election-specific stuff that maybe you have a question or point to raise at this point. Going once, going twice. All right. So we'll move on. So municipal government, all governments, when I talk about the role that governments play in our communities, I often find myself talking about kind of reiterating why they exist, because I think it's easy to forget, especially when you get caught up in some of the more bureaucratic elements of government. But the reason we have government, any government, whether it's democratic or not, is to control power. We live in a world where governments, regardless of where you live, a democracy or not, regulate certain things. They have control over many of our public spaces and the rules for all of our spaces, public and private, and a lot of the things that have an impact on the way we carry ourselves in everyday life, and the way we relate to other citizens and we relate to the public institutions and public services we have. Governments exist to control power, and democratic governments exist to ensure that power is controlled by the people, and that we have elections to share that power. And the consequence of an election is we end up with a government who has some legitimacy to exercise that power on our behalf. It's representatively democratic. It's not directly democratic, but it's what we have. Municipal governments are responsible, traditionally we think of them as being responsible for a few key areas: public water, sewage, waste management, public transit, if we have it, road maintenance and snow removal on kind of town roads, libraries, recreation facilities, and I would also say a growing number of things. I think there's good recognition within all levels of public policy and social problem solving and economic problem solving that the biggest problems that we are left facing don't necessarily obey jurisdictional boundaries and don't necessarily fall neatly into, you know, who's responsible for what in kind of like the lists of responsibilities that each government has. So I think things like affordable housing fall in that category. Things like poverty in local communities fall in that category. Things like social inequities within a community. Yeah, we have income tax systems that are run by the federal and municipal or provincial governments. We have kind of strictly named responsibilities for specific services that fall to each level of government, but many complex problems are falling kind of between governments. So just a footnote that there's specific things that governments do, are responsible for, and can be held accountable on, but I think there's a growing understanding among kind of experts working in complex problem solving and citizens who are dealing with problems every day that we don't necessarily get to say that that's not my job, so that there will be things that if you're successful probably come across your desk that don't necessarily fit in kind of the pretty flow chart that you could create about who's responsible for what. So councils are the governing body of our municipal government. We elect them to basically be in control and in charge of the government. And they do that by doing really three things. Number one, they set bylaws and policies. So they set kind of the rules of the municipality, both broadly in terms of what citizens are responsible for, but also from kind of like a public service perspective. So they have an influence on everything that happens underneath them, even though they do not manage it. They approve budgets, so they have ultimate say over what is financed and what is not, what's funded and what's not. I'm talking about councils as a whole. Another element of a councillor's job is, depending on where you live, some discretionary budget for community initiatives, and that is something that individual councillors have responsibility for, but as council as a whole, you approve the citywide or townwide or village-wide budget. The third role is kind of managing, overseeing, and reviewing what happens in the municipality. And I say manage is probably the wrong word. The council is responsible for one staff person, the chief administrative officer, who reports directly to council, who has some of the executive duties we would traditionally associate with like a premier or a prime minister in provincial and federal government, that oftentimes people assume the mayor has or the warden has simply because they're the mayor or the warden. But councillors have an oversight role. On many boards they often say, and council operates in kind of like the ideal vacuum of a world that we can talk about governance in, like a board, in the sense that individual members of council don't necessarily have say over particular operations matters. So whether or not snow removal happens at a certain place, or whether or not garbage removal is done in a certain way at a certain time, or certain specific issues that are the responsibility of staff get addressed in one order or not. There certainly is an unofficial influence that we often hear, depending on the municipality, that councillors have because of kind of the role they have and the voice they speak with. But officially, councils oversee the words that I find most helpful when thinking about the role of a council or a board: oversight, foresight, and insight. So they can oversee, they can look ahead and think about what is coming up, and they can provide insight from their own wisdom and perspectives, and also that of their constituents, and be the voice. I'll talk a bit about the mayor's role. So we have mayors and wardens in Nova Scotia. Mayors are elected by citizens. Wardens are elected by other councillors. So mayors are, again, I'll mention that we often think of them in the same way we think of a prime minister or a premier, but that's not actually accurate because they don't have as much executive level authority as a premier or prime minister would, who can kind of make much more executive level decisions in terms of hiring and firing, or setting strategic directions within a government department and that sort of thing. The mayor is the chair of council. Her primary job, or his primary job, is to ensure that council reaches decisions on things with clarity, so that the chief administrative officer and their staff can deliver on policies, budgets, bylaws effectively. The mayor also gets tasked with a lot of spokesperson type duties. representing the municipality elsewhere. And when they're going there, they're representing the citizens and kind of the council as a whole. Mayors have a position of community leadership that, even though they are one member of council, they are the chair, and that they don't necessarily get to set the direction of council. They campaign as if they do and have the legitimacy to speak on behalf of citizens across the municipality, which in some municipalities where we do elect councillors at large, you get from other councillors, but in most, it happens that it's only the mayor that is elected by all citizens in the municipality, and councillors are individually elected by district. So the mayor is really the only one that has a lot of the times legitimacy to speak on behalf of citizens of Cape Breton Regional Municipality or citizens of Halifax Regional Municipality. So that's important, and to say that all they do is be the chair of council is probably an understatement, because they have a level of leadership which I think that the other councillors will respect in ways that they wouldn't from one councillor to another councillor. The mayor is certainly more involved in overseeing some of the stuff that the CAO would do, and has a more probably personal relationship with them, but the boss of the CAO, the Chief Administrative Officer, is the council, not the mayor. So if you remember back when Peter Kelly was the mayor, he and the CAO got into some trouble for checks signed and loans and / grants made to certain things without necessarily having council approval or council involvement in the decision, and they were treating it as if it was more of an executive level position when neither of them really were. So the CAO, just to say a bit more about their role, they manage staff, so heads of departments within the municipality is part of who would report to them. They report to council directly. They're accountable to council. They're not accountable to the voters, only indirectly through council. And they're responsible for delivering on bylaws, policies, budgets, etc. So I've talked really about the official job of councils and councillors and mayors. There's also kind of, I would say, the more unofficial job, and I think we'll hear more of it from the panel that's coming up because we have 3 councillors with us. But the kind of unofficial job, I would say, of councillors, at least from kind of the perspective of governance experts or people who study democratic institutions, is more of the kind of community leadership role that an elected official plays, any elected official plays. So because you're a community leader, people will go to you with the expectation that you will help them solve your problems. Whether that's my garbage wasn't picked up or whether that's, my family doesn't have food. And like I mentioned earlier, these are complex problems. The fact that it's not the municipality's responsibility to do something in terms of kind of like rules and what's written doesn't necessarily mean that that's what your constituents think. And it doesn't necessarily mean, I used to be more of a hard-line approach person that, councillors should focus on making policies and bylaws and all of this. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do things about it. One of the fascinating things we learned about when we sat down with former MLAs is the level of responsiveness people have when an MLA or a councillor picks up the phone and says, this needs to happen. It doesn't even need to be somebody who's working for the municipality, working for the government, but the fact that a community leader picks up the phone and says, hey, we need help, can carry a great influence. So there's 2 things I would say about that. One, expect people, if you're elected, to come to you for that sort of thing. And give some thought to what you would do about it and how you would address those things. And 2, think about what else you can do. Like, you have a level of influence. You don't need to wait for people to come to you necessarily. You can decide, you know what, I really care about, like Jim Mustard in Cape Breton is a good example. Early childhood education is something that he's passionate about. Not really a municipal responsibility, but through his position in the community, through any councillor's position in the community, if you're well respected, you can be a really effective fundraiser. You can be a really effective connection maker, a networker, and that's kind of the, you're not going to see that written down anywhere, but it's what people will expect and an opportunity and kind of like a level of social capital that you have to spend. So something to keep in mind. 2 other things. Last things I'll say before we open it up for a brief period of questions or discussion Important to take a look at what the time commitment is for being a councillor in wherever it is you plan to run. If you're coming from a place like Halifax, it's a full-time job. It's a ton of constituents, and it goes along with that full-time salary. In other places, it's, from what I understand, can be more like volunteering on a board of directors. Maybe you get a small stipend, but the expectations are maybe monthly meetings, maybe bi-weekly meetings, not as heavy of a workload, but potentially just as heavy, demands from citizens who may not care whether or not you're full-time or whether or not you're salaried to the level of, for the level of time commitment you put into the job. And there's a link on our website, I don't think they're to a UNSM, Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities, document that reviews some of the municipal compensation rates for councillors and mayors. It's not totally up to date, but some of the municipalities are there, so worth taking a look if you're not aware at this point what a councillor makes and what impact, what the expectation is in terms of time commitment and whether or not that fits with your current employment and social obligations.